Hello, and a very warm welcome to the programme from me, David Foster. You know, mankind's encroachment on the habitats of wild animals could well lead to more virus pandemics. So says a major study by wildlife experts. Apparently, the closer we as a species get to them, the more risk there is to us. Have we brought all of this on ourselves? You're watching Roundtable. They are called zoonotic diseases. Clearing land, hunting, and wildlife markets have brought virus carriers into much greater proximity to people. And COVID-19 is just one of many diseases waiting to jump the species barrier.
Scientists have long drawn attention to human diseases that have originated in animals, including SARS, MERS, and Ebola. In the wake of coronavirus, there is a growing awareness that human health is linked both with animal health and the health of the planet as a whole. As COVID-19 spreads across the globe, scientists are warning that infectious diseases are connected to environmental change. A study from the University of California, Davis, found that humans are being brought into closer contact with wildlife because of hunting, the animal trade, habitat degradation, and urbanization. And this increases the risk of virus spillover. A wide range of organisations are calling for curbs on wild animal trade to reduce risks to human health. So as the true cost of the damage to animal habitats becomes clear, is it time we find more sustainable ways to coexist?
Right, let's bring in our experts. Let the conversation begin. In a little while, we'll be talking to Professor Andrew Cunningham from the Zoological Society of London and Carl Safina, ecologist and author of books about man's relationship with the natural world. But first, let us introduce Dr. Suresh Mittal, Professor of Virology at Purdue University in the United States, and Christian Walzer of the Wildlife Conservation Society, Executive Director of Health Programs. Thank you both very much indeed for joining us. Suresh Mittal, Professor Mittal, let me ask you first of all, one of the most horrifying things that I've read about this is that what are known as spillover diseases, when they move from animals, mostly wildlife in this particular case, to humans, have trebled every decade since the 1980s. Why is that?
I would say the reason largely is that if we look at the deforestation which is going on annual basis, that how much land is being taken away from the nature or from the wildlife, and this is a huge amount of land is got converted for urbanization or for agriculture or for other use. So with that, the habitat for wild animal is being lost, and with that, we are coming in contact with this wild animal more than we used to do in the past. And the animal which we have domesticated, some of those diseases has passed on. So for newer diseases, what we are getting from these new contacts, what we are getting from, say, primates or from bats or from other species. And if you look at in last couple of decades, the disease we have got, multiple of them, they have came from bats. And if you consider the bats are on the run, and that's why we are getting in contact. And some of those diseases in bats, they don't cause any infection in them. So they are sort of reservoirs. And
yes, so it is us getting closer to them, taking over their space, and also the fact that, as I understand it, with those species that are threatened, their survival is threatened. There are now twice as many zoonotic diseases as they're known in those species compared to those that are not threatened. Is it something to do with the stress factors as well?
It may not be the stress factor. The reason being that when there are any pathogen in any wild animal species, can they able to jump to human directly, or they need a intermediary host? In some instance, we have found that they can jump directly, and for some higher multiplication, they need an intermediary host. For example, Nipah virus needed pig to amplify the virus, and Hendra virus needed horses to amplify the virus. So in this particular case of COVID, we don't have, you can say, 100% clue that did it came from bat or some other animal directly, or did it amplify in certain host. And even when these viruses jump from wildlife to human, sometimes they also get, you can say, modified to some extent so that they can infect people effectively and spread from people effectively. So I think.
Suresh, I'm going to come back to you in just a moment, but I want to bring up a quotation from Inga Anderson, UN Environment Chief, and this is what Inga Anderson said: "Our continued erosion of wild spaces has brought us uncomfortably close to animals and plants," which is what you've been saying, animals and plants that harbour diseases, etc., etc. At the end of the day, all of these events, nature is sending us a message. And Christian, I want to ask you, you've recently given a video conference to Congress investigating this. For obvious reasons, you couldn't travel. What was your message to Congress? Is it that nature is sending us a message?
Well, I think it's very clear, as was pointed out, that nature is sending a message. You know, we've been messing with nature, encroaching on nature, creating these new interfaces, which are allowing the spillover of pathogens. The more we encroach on nature, the larger the interface gets. And as we've been pointing out, these market interfaces, especially in Southeast Asia, are just extraordinary interfaces where we are just, it's a numbers game. We're just providing more possibilities for spillover events to happen.
The Chinese have, as I understand it, now said that these wildlife, these wet markets, will be illegal. A, do you trust that? And secondly, will that be enough? Does there have to be a worldwide ban?
Well, yeah. So the Chinese authorities and administration reacted really fast, which is sort of, I find it sort of an indication that they're pretty sure that the spillover happened from wildlife, even though at the moment, as was pointed out, we don't know the intermediary host. So they temporarily closed the markets and now working on the permanent ban of all wildlife related to consumption. And I do trust them. I have seen in the background, you know, behind the scenes, how they're working on legislation. I think it'll be strongly implemented and enforced. That being said, there are markets obviously beyond China, many, and Vietnam has followed suit, so that's great. Vietnam on the 1st of March announced they would do the same. Now we're waiting for Cambodia and Laos PR, and then the big one also Indonesia, which also has huge markets, and we haven't heard too much there. And these.
Let me ask you about this. Sorry if I may interrupt.
No,
people are monsterizing, if you like, bats, monsterizing pangolins because they could be the initial hosts for these things. And yet, one of the things that you've said that fascinated me was that the benefits of being close to these species far outweigh the dangers.
Absolutely. So one of the things that's really important, while bats have obviously been implicated with MERS and SARS-1, and with Ebola, they've always been implicated. The main reason is because there are just a lot of bats. Yeah, there's about 1,400 and some species of bats. So there are a lot of bats, and it's probably host neutral. That means it doesn't actually matter so much where the host is. They all have the same amount of viruses. It's just there are a lot more bats, rodents, than anything else on the planet in the mammal department. So that's why we're getting these bats out there. And as you say, the ecosystem services they provide in pollination and pest control by far outweigh any kind of perceived danger we see from them. So leaving bats alone
necessarily vilify them. We must learn to understand them and perhaps treat them in different ways. Don't sell them for food in wet markets. Suresh, let me come to you once again. You mentioned earlier on a couple of other viruses that people may not be familiar with. I think one was Nipah, the other may have been Hendra. How many different types of viruses are out there that are waiting to jump from any kind of animal to humans at any one time?
I would say, David, this is excellent questions and answer nobody knows. The reason is that when we got the Hendra virus, which came to horses and human and causing lung infection and high mortality, the same way is the Nipah virus in pig and then human. Nobody knew these viruses do exist in the nature. So currently, we know a number of viruses exist in the wildlife, but we don't know each and every virus and which one can jump. And I think the we need to keep on working with the nature and finding out which are the viruses in the wild which can jump and keep an eye on that. At that time, we may be able to know which is closer to jumping to human.
I think you're working on vaccines for some of these other diseases. When you see what is being said about a vaccine for COVID-19, are you hopeful that one will arrive within 6 months by the end of the calendar year, or is that just a vain hope?
I would say when we hear on the news, they are usually too optimistic. I would say some kind of vaccine may be available in 6 months, but the real vaccine probably more than a year away. And the reason I'm saying that for COVID-19, if we consider, we need the vaccine most for the elderly population because high mortality and severity of the disease, people above 50 and 60 keep on increasing. So immunizing the elderly is always a challenge, and the best example is influenza.
I just wanted to throw this one to Christian. There we have Suresh talking about different vaccines for different diseases, and this is the problem, isn't it? If we get one for COVID-19, and I'll get the numbers wrong here, we might need one for COVID-20, then COVID-21, and then COVID-22, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, unless we change our behavior.
Yes, absolutely. So there is actually an estimate out there. There's a modeling exercise which is based on our work and that of our colleagues on the market interfaces and the sampling we've been doing in the past 10 years. And that has actually estimated that about 1.6 million unknown viruses in mammals and birds. Of those, 700,000 are thought to have the potential to cause zoonotic disease. Now, even if we got it wrong by an order of magnitude, there's a lot of virus out there. So the only way we can address this is changing our behavior at that interface and basically, leaving the bats and the wildlife alone. And that's the only way we can limit these spillover events. There's practically no way that we can ever ascertain which viruses are going to spill over in the future. There are just far too many of them.
But given mankind's behavior and the fact that these zoonotic diseases are trebling every 10 years, and that may accelerate, what evidence or what hope do you have that humankind is going to change its behavior, effectively retreat from the natural frontier, leave these animals on their own where they cannot do any harm to humankind, and redress the balance? What hope do you have of that?
So, interestingly, I've been working on this now nonstop since mid-January, basically. And for me, the world has just changed completely. There is absolutely no going back. And that is in my interactions with administration, multilateral funders, and so on. I really am convinced and optimistic the world is changing, clearly understands the implications of the encroachment of nature. And, on the risk reduction side, closing down these live markets, which are these super interfaces, is already a really important step, and we're halfway there already. So I think that's a really good thing, and I am very optimistic that we will change our perception of the world as we move forwards. There's no going back.
That is very encouraging to hear. Christian Walzer, thank you very much indeed. Professor Suresh Mittal, working on other vaccines at the moment and taking a keen interest in what is happening with a possible vaccine for COVID-19. Thank you both very much for joining us on Roundtable.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, at this stage in the programme, we welcome Professor Andrew Cunningham from the Zoological Society of London and Carl Safina, ecologist and author of books about man's relationship with the natural world. Great to have you both with us. Andrew, at the end of the last section, we were talking to Christine Walzer, who I know is an old friend of yours, and he said he was fairly optimistic that we could sort this out in a matter of time. But you thought that after the SARS epidemic, you thought things would change, and they haven't.
That's right. I thought that when SARS had occurred, that we would look for the lessons to learn from how that spillover had occurred from wildlife and try to stop it from happening again. And if we look at, there have been many other spillovers since then from wildlife, such as Ebola, Nipah, Hendra, and many others. And if we look at them, they're almost always due to how human beings are interacting with the wildlife. I mean, we think of wildlife having these viruses and other pathogens that can infect us, but it's our behaviors that allow them to infect us. And
what should we be doing differently, rather other than simply, or perhaps having wet markets and living too close to them? What else should we be doing?
Well, what we need to do is to understand what the risk factors are for these pathogens to spill over into people. There are some obvious things like having intimate contact, close contact with wild animals, with raw meat and body fluids and so on. And but it's more complicated than that, because it's not just direct human to wildlife interaction, but it's the way we're causing wild animals to interact with other wild animals and then with us. And that provides a bridge almost for spillovers to occur.
Carl, what do you think we're doing wrong? Because you talk about a broken relationship between humankind and the animal population.
Yes. In my view, it is not about nature. It's about the unnatural ways that we have treated wild animals and wild nature in these horribly intensified ways. For one thing, eating apes and eating monkeys has sparked a number of these new diseases, which are accelerating in their appearances. We've had SARS, we've had MERS, we've had Marburg, Ebola, HIV, all of these things in relatively recent decades at an accelerating rate. And in the farming realm, bringing wild animals into these markets, they call them wet markets. I think that's a kind of a silly term. They're wild animal markets, bringing wild animals from different parts of the world where they would never normally interact, jamming them up together in filthy conditions full of fluids like blood and water. These are viral test tubes where essentially the viruses can test new mutations to see if they can find more market share in the world. And they have a big market in 7 billion human beings, that they have every day many opportunities to test new ways of getting into us through these markets that jam these animals together in ways they would never be in the wild. They would never meet in the wild, animals from different parts of the world. They're handled in filthy conditions. And our normal domestic animals, what we think of normal domestic animals, pigs, swine flu comes from pigs. It doesn't come from wild animals. Bird flu comes from domestic poultry and ducks.
Can I just jump in, if I may, at this point and ask you whether, in fact, the world's attention should be directed on Southeast Asia, where an awful lot of these wet markets, as they're called, occur, or whether, in fact, the rest of the world is also to blame for us having arrived at this position?
Well, we've seen these new diseases arising in South Asia, Southeast Asia. We've seen them from Africa. We've seen them from the U.S. It's how we treat the animals and how we treat nature in these extremely unnatural ways that are the viral test tubes for bringing new epidemics into humanity. This one happens to be a pandemic. Luckily for us, it's killing only about 3% of the people it infects. If Marburg went pandemic, or Ebola went pandemic, we would see death rates of around 50%. It's complete collapse of civilization in that case. What do we do differently in the wake of all those earlier epidemics? We've done nothing differently. We
Well,
need to
this is one of the
stop.
points I know, Andrew, that
If
you
I
are
can just
making.
say,
Yeah, please.
yeah, actually, you say we've done nothing differently. We've made things worse. We've loaded the dice against ourselves even more, because
Right.
we've not only increased the volume of wildlife trade and trafficking and so on, and encroachment into wildlife habitats. We're bringing wild animals together from many different parts of the world that we haven't done until the last couple of decades. So we're bringing animals from Africa and South America and Asia into these markets together, which means that we're giving more and more opportunities for viruses and other pathogens to spill over from their natural host, in which they often do very little, if any, harm at all.
You talk about the relatively low death rate, Carl, when it comes to COVID-19. Are you worried that unless lessons are learned about man's proximity to nature, the next big one, could be a great deal worse than this already terrible one?
Oh, absolutely. I agree with
Of
Carl
course.
100% on this one. For example, we know that there's a virus called Nipah virus, which regularly spills over from bats into people, either through pigs or directly because of the way people interact with these bats that carry the virus. Nipah virus has a 60 to 75%, in some cases 100% case fatality rate. So that could be catastrophic if that virus was ever able to become efficient at transmitting from person to person. Now, in some of these outbreaks, there has been person-to-person transmission, but the R naught number, the number of people infected by an infected person, has been below 1, so the disease has died out quite quickly. But it's an RNA virus, and RNA viruses can adapt quite quickly to new hosts. So each time there's a spillover event, we're giving this virus yet another opportunity to become a pandemic.
And you say, how many more warnings do we need, Andrew? I'm wondering, perhaps it's quite an obvious question, this one. If we stopped eating meat, in other words, because you say interacting, and I think by that you basically mean consuming these animals that are infected. If we stopped interacting, perhaps these things wouldn't happen if we gave up eating meat.
Certainly, eating meat is one of the main drivers for zoonotic emergence, but it's not the only one. It would reduce the risks immensely, but the risks wouldn't have gone away because of the way that we interact with wildlife in the wild, with increased encroachment, with road building, with logging, with mining, and so on. So there are other ways that we are becoming exposed to diseases that we haven't historically become exposed to. And even if we have in the past, it's been at a very local level, and people have either died or got better before they've been able to pass the disease on to other people. But in our increased connected world with our increased human population, it's much easier now for a person who gets sick in the rainforest to pass that disease on, and for that disease to then spread to major urban conurbations around the world.
Carl, I'm not putting words into Andrew's mouth. He told us this before the program. He's called this a time bomb. If we don't do anything about this, what's going to happen in your opinion?
The trend is that these new epidemics are happening more frequently. So what will happen if we don't do anything to address these problems, and I totally agree with Andrew, we have made them worse, is that we will get more epidemics more frequently, and the chances of another pandemic are much higher. I think more epidemics more frequently is guaranteed. That's been the trend. And because we have more connectivity, more people traveling all over the place more frequently, I think that the chances for another pandemic are also greatly elevated. And the chances that the next
than you, me, Andrew, our other guests in the program, Suresh and Christian, who has to listen to this and take notice?
Well, these things are mostly matters of government policy. Governments regulate markets, governments regulate farming. These things are mostly matters of government policy. To another extent, they're a matter of population. We have 7 billion on the way to 10 billion, eating and whittling our way farther and farther into all corners of the world, turning over every rock, every log, everything edible. We've known for a long time that this is not a sustainable thing. We've all worried that it's mostly not a sustainable thing because we are obliterating the rest of life on Earth. But now it's coming back around, and
Indeed,
we're experiencing.
I'm going to have to stop you there. Appreciate it very much indeed. That's Carl Safina. Also, many thanks to Professor Andrew Cunningham, not only obliterating the rest of life on Earth, but allowing perhaps the rest of life on Earth to take its revenge on us by obliterating perhaps large parts of the human race. It's not a very optimistic note, but at least we had a sense of where things could go from all of our guests on this edition of Roundtable. Thank you very much indeed for watching. From me, David Foster, and the rest of the team, we hope to have your company next time. Goodbye for now.